In this episode of the OmniStudio series, we are diving into integration procedures, what they are, why they are useful, and how they connect with other OmniStudio tools. If you are familiar with Flow or Apex, I'll help you think about integration procedures in a way that builds on what you already know so you can learn faster. With this, let's get into it. Alright everybody, introduction to integration procedure. So today this is what we'll be covering. First, we'll do a recap of what we have covered in this OmniStudio series so far. Then we'll start with the basics, what an integration procedure is and why it's so useful. Then I'll walk you through the integration procedure designer. This is the canvas where everything comes together. After that, we'll break down the key elements inside an integration procedure, and I'll show you how each one relates to familiar tools like Flow and Apex, so you can learn faster by building on what you already know. Once you understand the building blocks, I'll show you how integration procedures fit into the broader OmniStudio ecosystem, including how they connect with OmniScripts, FlexCards, datamappers, and more. And of course, we'll wrap it up by building a simple integration procedure together, step by step, so you can follow along. At the end, I'll give you a quick look at what's coming up next in this integration procedure video series. Let's get started. Before we start diving into integration procedures, let's do a recap of what we have covered in this series so far. So let's first take a step back and talk about why you need to learn OmniStudio. So if you are building digital experiences in Salesforce, especially things like self-service portals where it contains many application forms, OmniStudio is the best for that because it's built for speed, flexibility, and reusability. It's designed to help you build with clicks instead of code, while still delivering powerful backend logic. If you need to have a revision on OmniStudio overview and architecture, I highly recommend you to check out my video on this. So in that video, I used a restaurant analogy to explain how all of the pieces of OmniStudio work together, from front of the house tools like OmniScripts and FlexCards to back of the house tools like datamappers and integration procedures. So it's one of the easier ways to visualize the architecture. And we've also done a deep dive into datamappers. We explored how to use them and work through hands-on exercises. And now we are ready to level up to integration procedures. So think of integration procedures as the brains of the operation. While datamappers can move data around, integration procedures can control the flow, make decisions, call datamappers, call Apex, and even communicate with external systems, all in one streamlined process. So this is where OmniStudio architecture really shines. You've got OmniScript as the user interface, FlexCards for displaying information in context. You have datamappers for handling Salesforce data, and integration procedures acting as the central logic engine behind everything. So now you've got a feel for the foundation. Let's now really dive into what an integration procedure is. So, what is an integration procedure? Let's break this integration procedure down into two parts, integration and procedure. So integration is about bringing different parts together so they work as a whole. And procedure is essentially a series of steps done in a specific order to achieve something. Now, putting these two words together, it basically means a set of actions used to bring together systems or data sources so that they can talk to each other and work in sync. In Salesforce OmniStudio, an integration procedure is a server-side process that runs behind the scenes. So it's used to gather, transform, and update data efficiently from both Salesforce and external systems. As mentioned earlier, integration procedure is declarative, so no coding required. It's high performance and designed to run multiple actions in a single server code, which is great for digital experiences like portals and APIs. So on a high level, with integration procedures, you can read and write Salesforce data, you can make calls to external systems, you can trigger epics, it can serve as a data source for components like FlexCards and OmniScripts. Now we know roughly what it can do. Let's walk through what happens inside this example diagram. And don't worry if you don't understand all the details. I'm just giving you context as to where integration procedure fits in the wider Salesforce system and OmniStudio tools. We'll go over each of these elements in much more detail later on in the series. So in this diagram, we have OmniScript industry data model over here, the integration procedure engine, emails, and external system. So let's walk through this and talk about how all of these can communicate with each other. So here we have an OmniScript calling an integration procedure. First, we heard the datamapper pre-transform. This converts the incoming data, usually in JSON, into XML. You might be asking why we need to convert from JSON to XML. This is because for some external systems, especially legacy or SOAP-based ones, require XML format. OmniStudio works in JSON by default, so this step basically prepares the data for external consumption. Next, the HTTP action sends this XML data to an external system via REST or SOAP. When the external system sends back a response, often in XML, we need to use post-transform to again convert XML back into JSON so that OmniStudio can work with it again. So think of these two transformation steps as translators that make sure our data can flow between Salesforce and external systems that speak different languages or formats. So after this, we might use a datamapper load to write new records back into Salesforce, and optionally we can send emails using Salesforce email API, and finally the end process step wraps up everything and returns a final response in JSON. So all of these steps run on the server side in a single efficient execution. So all of this capability makes integration procedure a very important tool, especially when you need to develop something quickly and scalable without writing Apex code. Alright, now we know what an integration procedure is. Let's take a look at the integration procedure designer. First things first, you'll need a Salesforce developer org with OmniStudio installed. If you don't have one yet, I've got you covered. Check out episode 1 of the OmniStudio series for a quick guide on how to set one up. I'll include the link in the description below. Once you are in the OmniStudio enabled org, open the OmniStudio app and head over to OmniStudio integration procedures. From here, you can do quite a few things. You can search for existing integration procedures. You can create new ones. You can import an integration procedure JSON file. You can set up filters for this integration procedure list view. You can also deactivate and activate existing integration procedures, export and publish. We'll go over all of these in much more detail later on in the series, but for now, to get started, just click on the new button to create your first integration procedure. So after the new button is clicked, you'll see an integration procedure designer opens up. So step one is to set up basic information. So we'll start in the properties section. So here is where you give your integration procedure a name, a type, subtype, and description. Just like data mappers, these fields are super important. It's important to follow a good and consistent naming convention so that for you and your team, it's a lot easier to, by reading the name, knowing what this integration procedure does. So let's start with type. The type field, what I usually follow is it can be the business domain or functional category. So for example, in this integration procedure, we want to get all the organization accounts. So what we can do is we can classify this as a data service. For the subtype, it describes the purpose or the target action. So in this case, it's get organization accounts. And for the integration procedure name, I usually start with IP for integration procedure, followed by the type and subtype. In description field, it's usually a short summary. So in this case, it fetches the organization accounts. And you then click save. Once that's all done, you'll notice there are a lot of fields here that you can configure. We'll leave these out for this video for now. We'll revisit these settings in much more detail later on in the series. So once the integration procedure is now saved, you'll notice that a new tab called preview is appearing. We'll just touch on this briefly now and dig into a much deeper in another video, but let's go back and focus on the integration procedure designer canvas first. So the integration procedure designer has 4 key sections: available components, structural panel, properties, and preview. In the available components panel, this is where you'll find groups and actions you can use. So these are similar to flow elements or specific Apex functions or classes. Structural panel, this is where you can drag components from the available components section onto here to build your integration procedure step by step. So you can think of these like flow, where you can get elements or create elements on the flow designer. Element properties. So let's take dataraptor extract action, for example. In the properties tab, this is where you can tweak the settings, or even you can edit the JSON directly if required. And again, we'll go into all of these settings for all of these different elements that you can do in much greater detail later on in the series. But for now, just focus on how we can navigate through this integration designer canvas. And the preview tab, as mentioned earlier, this is where you can test your integration procedure by putting in test parameters. You can either input the test parameters in key value pairs, or you can use JSON. And once you have put something in your test parameters, you can execute it. And in the response section, this is where you can see the response from your integration procedure based on your input parameters. And you can also see this section here, errors and debug output. This is where you can use debug logs, similar to debug logs in Apex. And you can actually look at individual steps here and review the JSON. And it's also quite similar to the debug functionality in Flow. Now that you have good understanding of how to navigate in the integration procedure designer canvas, let's just clean some of this up. And we'll delete all of these. Before we go and create our first integration procedure, let's just go through these groups and actions element and compare them with Flow and Apex to build on what you might already know, so we can learn this a lot faster. Alright, let's start with the actions and we'll come back to the groups. So starting with expression set actions. So if you are new to Business Rules Engine, expression set is part of the Business Rules Engine. It basically performs complex business calculations. It accepts JSON as input and performs calculations and return JSON output to the processes that calls the expression set. Again, we'll go over all of this in much more detail later on. Now just know what expression set action does. And this expression can actually be called in Flow as well. In Flow, you'll add an action element and you'll select expression set and select your expression set that you have set up in your Business Rules Engine, configure your input parameters, etc. In terms of invoking expression set, it can be done via Apex or REST API. Next, let's take a look at chatter action. So this allows you to perform posts on chatter, and in a similar way for Flow, you can set up an action that allows you to post to chatter. And from the Apex perspective, there's chatter class and associated chatter methods that allows you to interact with chatter. Next, let's take a look at datamapper actions together. So in previous datamapper deep dive videos, we've covered datamapper turbo extract, datamapper extract, datamapper post, and datamapper transform. Now, if you are new to datamapper's OmniStudio or JSON, I highly recommend you checking out my datamapper videos first. I'll include the links in the description below. Before diving into integration procedures, it's very important to be familiar with datamappers because integration procedures are more complex. You also need a solid understanding of JSON, which you will gain by watching these videos and practicing along the way. Alright, so let's take a look at the datamapper turbo action and datamapper extract action first. So these two actions basically call datamappers. So for example, for datamapper turbo extract action, it's able to call datamapper turbo extract. And what you need to do is you just need to specify it in the datamapper interface here. And don't worry about all of this. We'll cover this in much more detail later on in the series. And that is basically the same with datamapper extract actions, where you will specify datamapper interface here. From the flow builder's perspective, datamapper turbo extract and datamapper extract, they are basically your get record elements where you will specify an object and filter conditions. And essentially what you are doing in the backend is you are basically writing a so-called query. So from the Apex world, you are basically writing a so-called query statement to fetch these records. One key difference between datamapper turbo extract and datamapper extract is that datamapper turbo extract is only for extracting a single object, and it's higher performance than datamapper extract action, where it can extract one or multiple objects. Again, I've covered the similarities and differences in earlier videos, so I would encourage you to check them out. Next, we have datamapper post action. So this post action element calls a datamapper post, and depending on how the datamapper is set up with the upsell key, it can insert or update records. And we've also covered all of this in detail in earlier videos. So I will encourage you to check them out. So in the flow builders world, datamapper post is very similar to create records or update records. And in the Apex land, what this is doing is it's doing DML statements. So for create, it's basically inserting records into the Salesforce database, and for update, it's doing the update DML operation to update existing Salesforce records. Next, we have datamapper transform action. So this action calls a datamapper transform. To recap quickly, a datamapper transform is a special datamapper that doesn't extract from Salesforce or write into Salesforce. Instead, what it can do is it can transform the data structure so that it can be used for FlexCards, OmniScripts, datamappers, or integration procedures. In terms of flow, the closest to the datamapper transform is the transform element in Flow Builder. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to do data mapping and restructuring a lot like the datamapper transform. In terms of Apex, you can create custom Apex classes that can be used for complex data transformation to handle complex data structures and logic using a bunch of variables, flow statements like if else and switch statements to do data manipulation. Next, we have the delete action. So this action allows you to delete records. Now, one thing to note is that in OmniStudio, only integration procedures and OmniScript can delete records. FlexCards and datamappers can't delete records. In Flow Builder, this is similar to the delete records element, and in Apex, this is another DML statement where you can use the delete DML statement to be able to delete records in Salesforce. Next, we have DocuSign envelope actions. So for those that don't know what DocuSign is, basically it's a e-signature platform that lets users to send, sign, and manage documents electronically. So things like automated agreements, workflows, contracts, and onboarding forms. And based on my research, I believe you will need licenses or DocuSign accounts to be able to use this DocuSign envelope action here. And in a similar way, for Flow Builder, there are DocuSign actions here if you have licenses. And I believe that's the same with Apex as well. To be able to interact with our DocuSign products using Apex, you need separate licensing for that. Next, we have email actions. So this email actions allows you to send emails. You can select email templates, specify OGY email addresses, etc. Again, we'll go, just like all of these actions, we'll go this into much more detail later on. And from the Flow Builder, there is the send email action element. And in Apex, you have the email class and the associated methods to allow you to send emails. Next, we have integration procedure actions. So this allows you to call other integration procedures. So this concept is quite similar in Flow, where you can call other subflows. And in Apex, a similar concept would be a parent class calling other child classes or utility class. So if you design your integration procedure properly and allowing for scalability, you should be following a similar pattern where you have modular integration procedures that are reusable. Again, in this series, we'll go over how we can design scalable integration procedures. Next, we have intelligence action. Now, I don't think this is used very much, as I haven't used it personally, and looking at Salesforce help articles, I couldn't find much information on here. Basically, what this is saying is that integration procedures intelligence action provides input that runs an intelligence machine on OmniStudio. And when I go into here, there's not a lot of information on here, and I couldn't quite find what intelligence machine mean in OmniStudio. Next, we have list actions. List action is a very powerful action in integration procedures. It can combine two or more lists into a single list by matching some certain fields in your JSON nodes. So a basic merge example can be matching list items where the field names and values are exactly the same. A more advanced merge scenario can be matching items even if the field values have different names or are in different places in the data. So thinking in Excel terms, it's basically combining two spreadsheets on matching column values, and a simple merge example would be if the two spreadsheets have the same columns, and a more advanced merge example would be if the two spreadsheets have different columns but you need to merge them together. This is where advanced merge is required. Now, in terms of flow, there is no single element that's able to perform this. However, you can achieve similar functionalities to list actions by combining a bunch of elements together. So you have a loop item that loops through a list, and maybe some sort of decision element to look at what's in the list and perform various assignments and manipulation on your list, and possibly even doing some sort of transformation. So this is how you can achieve a similar functionality to the list action in integration procedure in the Flow Builder. Now, in the Apex world, you have list class and map class. These two classes are built in classes that allows you to store and manipulate collections, and you also have so-called queries with aggregation. So all of these are similar functionalities to the list action element in Integration Procedure Designer. And of course in Apex, it can be customized. You can create custom Apex methods to allow you to have custom logic to merge lists, filter duplicates, and restructure your data. Next, we have decision matrix action. So similar to expression set action, decision matrix action is part of the business rules engine. It's a very powerful tool. Essentially, it's a lookup table that contains user-defined input and output columns. The system basically takes in inputs and then looks up the appropriate outputs. Again, I'll do a series on business rules engine as well. So if you are not familiar with how business rules engines work, we will cover that in detail in upcoming videos. So decision matrix can also be called in Flow Builder. So again, you need to add an action element, and in here you can call decision matrix. And just like expression sets, decision matrix can also be invoked using Apex or REST API. Next, we have remote action. So this remote action allows you to call Apex classes. So in a similar manner in Flow Builder, you can create an action element and specify the invocable Apex classes over here. Next, we have response action. This is quite an important action. What it basically does is that it ends an integration procedure and returns data to the process that coded. So for example, if the integration procedure fetches a list of accounts and you want to have a list of accounts displayed on a FlexCard or OmniScript, the response action here will need to return a list of accounts in order for the data to be available for the FlexCard or OmniScript. And sometimes the response action can be quite useful for debugging purpose as well. Whatever you have on the response action here will actually display in the response. So if you need to do some debugging by displaying additional JSON nodes, this is where you would specify in your response action. In the Flow Builder's world, this is the response action element in integration procedure is similar to quite a few things. So it's similar to screen flow output. So let's say if a flow collects users' first name and last name, you can have a screen flow output that displays the full name back to the user. Another thing that's quite similar to the response action in integration procedure is the subflow, the return variables. So when you are using a subflow, you can define these output variables that you can pass data back to the main flow. So that's a similar concept here where you can specify what you want to return to the calling OmniScript, calling FlexCard, or even the calling integration procedure. Next, we have HTTP action. So this allows you to communicate with external systems using this HTTP action in integration procedure. In the Flow Builder's world, you can create HTTP callout by using an action element and click on create HTTP callout, and this will allow you to set up your HTTP callout to external services. In Apex, you can communicate with external systems using the HTTP classes to set up your HTTP request and HTTP response. Next, we have the set values element. This is a very powerful action that you'll need to master in integration procedures. The set values action can set values in the data.json in an integration procedure using merge fields, using formulas. The actions, as mentioned earlier, has many uses, and we'll go over all of these details later on in the series. In Flow, the set value elements are very similar to the assignment element, where you can assign a variable and manipulate your variables, and it's also quite similar to a formula where you can manipulate your variables that you've created or variables that you've assigned value to in your assignment elements. And in Apex, the set values element is basically how you assign your variables. Alright, let's now take a look at the groups element. First, we'll look at cache block. So in integration procedure, the cache block stores data to avoid repeating operations like API calls or queries. In Flow, there's no built-in cache block, but you can use Apex actions with platform cache, and in Apex you can cache data using platform cache for multi-session reuse, and we'll go into all of this later on in the series as well. Next, let's take a look at the conditional block. So these conditional blocks allows you to drag other actions in here, and you can set this up so that it becomes an if-else block. So you can think of conditional blocks in integration procedure as the decision elements in Flow, where you can set up different decision outcomes and order. And in the Apex world, this is like your conditional if-else statements. Next, we'll look at the loop block. In integration procedure, the loop block allows you to loop through a list or an array. And in the Flow builder, it's very similar to the loop element here, where you can specify a collection variable. And in Apex, it's like your for loop statements. Last but not least, let's take a look at try-catch block. So in integration procedure, try-catch block is used to gracefully handle errors and send failback responses. In Flow, it's very similar to the Flow fault path. So for example, if you have a getRecord element and for some reason the error occurs, and you can gracefully handle errors by adding the fault path here. And in Apex, you can perform exception handling using try-catch statements. Alright, now that you've got a solid understanding of what integration procedures can do, you might be thinking, hey, this actually feels pretty familiar, and you'll be right. If you have worked with flows or written some Apex, a lot of the logic building principles carry over, like in Flow, your decision elements, get record, query records, etc. In Apex, you have exception handling, try-catch blocks, so-called queries, and DML statements. In integration procedure, the big difference is that it offers some of the functionalities that Flow doesn't offer, and it's able to perform some of the actions that Apex offers. So you can do a lot of operations that you couldn't do in Flow, but in integration procedure at scale. So let's bring this to life. We are going to build a simple example together, step by step. In this example, we'll create an integration procedure that extracts account data and classifies the account based on its annual revenue. Let's get started. Now let's go into the OmniStudio integration procedure tab and click on New. Remember, always follow a consistent naming convention. It'll save you a lot of headaches later on. Let's start with the description. So what we want to do with this data, with this integration procedure, is to extract account details and classify the account as gold or silver based on annual revenue. For type, we will type in data service as this integration procedure. Its primary focus is fetching data. For subtype, we'll give it a descriptive name. We'll call it set account revenue classification. And for the integration procedure name, I like to start with IP and combining that with type and subtype. Once that's done, click on Save. Now, before we start building, let's plan this out together. So here is the high-level overview. So we have an integration procedure here. We'll pass in an account ID. The integration procedure will do some processing and you'll return a revenue classification as the response. So let's go back to the IP and let's see how we are going to design it. So when the IP takes in an account ID as input, this ID is passed into datamapper extract action, DM extract, and we use a different color here. The datamapper extract action will use this ID to do a query that extracts account details based on this provided ID here. And the datamapper extract action will return account data. And this will include fields such as name, ID, and most importantly, the annual revenue field that we need to determine the revenue classification. And this will be in JSON. So the integration procedure will take this JSON and do some processing or calculation to determine the revenue classification and whether the account should be classified as gold or silver. If it's above $1 million, we'll classify it as gold, otherwise it'll be silver. And finally, the revenue classification will be returned in the response. And everything that we are doing inside integration procedures is basically manipulating JSON data. Now let's go back to our example. So first thing we need to do is we need to build this datamapper extract action. Let's go to the Components tab and drag in datamapper extract action. And let's create a datamapper extract together. So there are two options. You can either go to the OmniStudio datamapper tab to create a new datamapper, or you can just use this drop down here and click on create new datamapper. For the name, we'll call it DM extract account details. Once it's created, it'll take a while to load. Once it loads, you'll automatically open up another tab here. Again, very important here, let's put in a description. Extract account details based on account ID. So I'll go over this quite quickly as we have covered datamapper extract in detail in previous videos. So over here, let's go to the extract tab. Select an object. In this case, we want to basically do a so-called query on account. For the extract output path, this is where we store the so-called query result. We'll just call it account ACC, short for account. Filter, this needs to be based on an ID. So if we come back and look at our screenshot here, we'll be passing in an ID to the datamapper extract. So this is where we name the input variable for our datamapper, and we'll call it account ID. And while we're over here, let's go back to the whiteboard and look at where we are. So we've decided on what we are going to call the input variable. So it's ACC ID. So let's write this here as well. So our input variable is account ID. And I'll explain all of this in more detail once we get into the designing of the IP. So we'll keep this in here for now. And before we start our output mapping, let's just take a look at the extract step.json. So this shows what we are doing. We are basically putting our so-called query result into this ACC node. And now let's build our so-called query and specify what fields we want this so-called query to return. Right, so there are a few fields that we want to return as part of this query. We want to return the ID, the name, and most importantly, the annual revenue. So let's set this up in the output tab. Extract JSON path, this is where we build our so-called query. Output JSON path, this is where we'll be returning the data back to the integration procedure. So let's start with the ID here. And we want to return under this node account data. So what we want to do is we'll call ACCT data, and we want to store the ID key into the ID key here. So I usually name these keys the same, so it's very easy to identify what the data is. You can name this whatever you want, but best practice is to name it what it is. So if it's ID, name it as ID. Next, we'll extract the name, and we're going to put it in, again, the same node and in the name key. Most importantly, the annual revenue, and again putting it in the account data node and storing the value in the annual revenue key. So you can start to see our current JSON output being built up in the output that we're going to return back to integration procedure. It's all going inside this account data node with the key and value pairs. Now that we've defined our output format, what we need to do next is we need to test this datamapper. So let's go into preview and add our input parameters. So our input is this account ID variable, and for the value we need to find account record. So I'll just use Edge Communications. Click on execute, and now we can see name is Edge Communications and ID matches with what we have here, and annual revenue 600k, and that's what we are seeing over here. And if we look at our debug log, we can see the query that we are running here. So we are running select annual revenue name ID from account where ID is equal to what we are putting in here. So now the data mapper design is complete and we've tested that it's working. Let's come back to the integration procedure. So coming back here, let's give it a meaningful element name. So we are basically extracting account details here. Now let's come back and take a look at where we are. So we've completed the design of the data mapper extract. Next, what we need to do is we need to make sure the data mapper extract action element is set up correctly. So from the integration procedures perspective, it's going to take account ID as an input. You'll pass this into the data mapper. The data mapper will return account data and we will process it and return revenue classification. So before we actually set this up, we need to make sure we can see whatever we are returning from the data mapper extract in the integration procedure. So let's set this up. So if I just run the integration procedure now, I wouldn't actually see anything here. And that's because we are missing a lot of the setup. In the debug log, it's going to show you what actions have been run. So we can see our extract account details here, which is this data mapper extract action element. If we click onto here, we'll see we are not getting anything here. And the reason is because for the data mapper to work, we actually need to enter the input parameters to pass in the ID from the integration procedure to the data mapper. And this is the bit that we'll work on next, is to set up passing of the ID from the integration procedure to the data mapper. Alright, so let's come back to here. And don't worry if a lot of this seemed very confusing the first time. We will go into all of this in much more detail later on in the series. So now just follow along and try to get an overall understanding of what integration procedures can do. So integration procedure will take in an input, and we are calling this account input variable for the integration procedure ACCT-ID. The integration procedure will need to pass in this account ID into the data mapper extract. In the data mapper extract, we have its own variable and it's called ACCID. So what we need to do now is to link this with this. And to do this, it's very simple. We have input parameters here, and this is where you link the integration procedure input variables with the data mapper input variable. So in here, we will go ACCTID, and the filter value is the variable that we are setting in data mapper extract, and in this case, it's ACCID. Now let's go into the preview and set this up. So again, we need to put in input parameters. For the key, it'll be the input variable for the integration procedure, which is ACCTID. It's this one here. For the value, again, we'll be using the same edge communication. record ID. Let's execute. Now we still see nothing in the response here, and I'll explain that in a bit. But now let's go to the debug log and go into our datamapper extract action. Now we are finally seeing what we are seeing in the datamapper response. So we can see name, annual revenue, and ID. That's all matching with what we are seeing over here. Now let's come back and review our whiteboard. So we've just completed the step passing of the IDs. What we want to do next is to be able to do more debugging. So seeing what we are seeing here in our response action. And to do that, we actually need to set up the response element. So let's come back to here and drag in a response action. And let's return the full data.json so we can see everything that you will see by default. Let's now click on preview. What we can see here is a lot of the system data, and also we can see our account data here as well. But this is now living inside another extract account details node, which is what we specify in the element name here. Now looking at this, it's quite messy, and later on in the series I'll talk about what the best practice is around how we should be returning data. But for now, let's just leave this as is and keep this simple. So let's return to our whiteboard. We now have verified that we can see this account data in the output. Let's now start the calculation part. So to do that, there's actually many different ways we can achieve this. But to keep this example simple, let's just use a set values element, and let's drag it after extract account details. We'll call this element determine revenue classification. So what we need to do here is to basically take annual revenue and have an if-else statement to determine whether we should return gold or silver. So to do that, everything is based on JSON. So to access this key, we need to do it through extract account details, then account data, then annual revenue. So let's set up the element here. Looking at this, we want to return this variable called revenue classification. So let's put it here, revenue classification. And let's look at the formula here that we need to do. So what I usually do is I'll copy this, open up the formula tab, and I'll delete the bits that I don't need. And in integration procedure, again, I'll go over this in much more detail. To access data, you need to use the colon symbol. Which is, I'll zoom in a bit more so you can see better, which is this here. So this is how you navigate between different JSON nodes levels, and we want to access it in integration procedure. So integration procedure, you need to use a percentage sign to essentially access your value inside this JSON path or JSON node. or you can consider this as a variable. So now that we can access this number here, which is 60K, by having this expression here, let's now work on our if-else statement. Again, I'll go over this much more detail later on the series, so just follow along for now. So if the annual revenue is greater than 1 million, then I want to return gold, otherwise return silver. And later on in the video series, I'm going to explain how we should be setting up all these nodes so that it's a lot easier to navigate, a lot easier to work with your JSON by setting all these send response transformations. And so stay tuned, I'll cover all of this in much more detail later on in the series. Right, so now let's go on preview and test this out. So when I click execute, I'm expecting to see the return of silver as we are under the $1 million mark. So if we come back to Edge Communications and change this to a bigger number, $10 million, when I come back here, click on execute, I should be seeing gold, and that's what we are seeing over here. So let's come back and look at our whiteboard. We've just completed this, so now it's able to return the revenue classification, whether it's gold or silver, based on the annual revenue data. And we are returning the response in this format, which is still not quite what we want to get to. We just want to return revenue classification, and we don't actually want to return any of these data that's not relevant. So to do that, let's come back to the Properties tab, go into Response Action. Let's not return the full data JSON. So once you remove this, when you come back to here, you actually see nothing because now it's not returning anything. So to actually return only what you want, you need to come back to here and return only additional output. And again, I'll go over all of this in much more detail later on in the series. So stay tuned, as there are many different ways to do it, and we can talk about best practice on how to actually do the send response transformations for the datamapper extract action element, and also the response transformations for the set values. Right, so to set this up, we need to first take a look at the full JSON again. So what we want to return is basically revenue classification. So let's copy this and come back to here, remove this, and add key value pair. So what we want to return is just the revenue classification key. And to get there, as we covered earlier, we need to use semicolon to access the key inside JSON node, and to use the percentage sign to access JSON key value pair. Click on OK, come back to preview, and we'll get a much cleaner output. So now you'll just be returning either gold or silver in this key value pair format. And this is exactly what we want here. So in short, we are passing in the account ID as an input variable to the integration procedure. Integration procedure does all the processing and return revenue classification as the output. I know I've covered this quite quickly, but later on in the series, I'll be covering all of these in much more detail. So stay tuned, and I promise in the end of the series, you'll be very comfortable working with integration procedures and also manipulating JSON data. Now that you have a better understanding of how integration procedures work, let's talk about how integration procedures can fit with other OmniStudio components. And we'll go over all of this in much more detail in this OmniStudio series as well. But now I just want to give you an overview of where integration procedure fits in Salesforce. So let's start with datamappers. So inside an integration procedure, you'll usually find one or more datamappers to read Salesforce records, to transform JSON, to create or update records. Next, OmniScript. So in an OmniScript, think of it as an application form. On the application form, it can ask details like your address, user's first name, last name, and also if you are, for example, applying for an application form, after you fill up the form, you'll create set application records. So in the OmniScript, it's quite common to call integration procedures to fetch Salesforce data to pre-populate some of the information that the system already has. For example, if you are logging in with your user account onto a portal, it's quite likely that we already have your first name and last name. So from the UI's perspective, user experience perspective, it's much better if you can pre-populate the data. So this is where the OmniScript will be calling integration procedures to fetch data that already exists in the system and pre-populate the application form. Once the application form is complete, the OmniScript will then call the integration procedure to create Salesforce record inside Salesforce based on what's being inputted on the application form. Next, we have FlexCards. So FlexCards are the user interface components that display contextual data on a page. So for example, on your external community portal, you want to use a FlexCard to display key information about the application, and you don't want to use the standard page layout component. You want to make it look a bit nicer by including some icons, for example. So this is where you can use FlexCard. FlexCard usually uses integration procedures to fetch data, and using these data that's fetched from integration procedures to display this data back to the user. Next, we have external systems. So integration procedures has built-in capabilities to talk to external systems. So for example, if you have invoice records in Salesforce, you want to send them to an external payment system, you can use integration procedures to make an HTTP call out to talk with the external systems and communicate and create these invoice records in external systems, and also receiving updates back from the external systems as well. Next, we have business rules engine. Integration procedures can call business rules engine to perform complex logical calculations that's required. So if you have a very complex calculation, for example, calculating insurance premiums, you can have a business rules engine that can work out complex calculations, and you just need to call this code this business rules engine in your integration procedure instead of trying to build all these complex calculations in the integration procedure itself. So let's do a recap. So today we have covered what an integration procedure is. We've gone over the integration procedure designer canvas. We quickly broke down each integration procedure components, elements that you can use, and we've made comparison with flows and epics to make it easier for you to learn. And we talked about why and when to use integration procedures. We've built a simple integration procedure together and how integration procedure fit into the wider OmniStudio system and how it interacts with each other. Coming up next, so this is what you can expect in the upcoming videos for this integration procedure series. We'll be doing deep dives into all elements in integration procedures. We'll cover design best practice, how to design scalable, maintainable, high-performing integration procedures. We'll be covering common design patterns and how to integrate the integration procedure with other OmniStudio components like FlexCards, datamappers, business rules engines, and OmniScript. And we'll go over debugging as well. And that's it for today's episode in the integration procedure series. I hope this has helped you better understand how integration procedure works on a high level. If you found the video helpful, do me a favor, hit the like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts or questions, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive video. We've got a lot more coming, from debugging tips to real-world examples and advanced concepts, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.